It was a cold winter morning in a small, bustling city. The streets were alive with the usual rush of people heading to work, cars honking, and the faint hum of life moving forward. Among the crowd, a homeless man sat quietly on the corner of a busy intersection. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by years of hardship, and his eyes carried a story of struggle and loss. He held a small cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." Most people walked past him, avoiding eye contact, lost in their own worlds. But one person noticed him, a police officer patrolling the area. The officer was a familiar face in the neighborhood. He had been on the force for over a decade and was known for his calm demeanor and willingness to help those in need. That morning, as he walked past the homeless man, something made him pause. It wasn't just the man's appearance or his sign, it was the look in his eyes. There was a quiet dignity there, a sense of resilience that spoke volumes. The officer crouched down to the man's level and struck up a conversation. "Hey there, how's your morning going?" the officer asked, his tone warm and friendly. The homeless man looked up, surprised. Most people didn't stop to talk, let alone a police officer. He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Not too bad, sir. Just trying to get by," he said softly. The officer nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He introduced himself and asked the man's name. The man hesitated again, as if he hadn't been asked that question in a long time. "It's been a while since anyone called me by my name," he said with a faint smile. "But you can call me John." The two talked for a few minutes. The officer learned that John had once been a construction worker but had lost his job after an injury. Without a steady income, he couldn't keep up with rent and eventually ended up on the streets. He had been homeless for nearly 2 years, surviving on the kindness of strangers and the occasional odd job. The officer listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. He knew that life on the streets was unforgiving, and he wanted to do something to help. Before leaving, the officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. He handed it to John, who looked at it with wide eyes. "This is too much, sir. I can't accept this," John said, trying to hand it back. But the officer shook his head. "Take it. Use it for something you need, a warm meal, a place to stay for the night, whatever helps." John's eyes filled with tears as he thanked the officer, his voice trembling with gratitude. It wasn't just the money, it was the kindness, the acknowledgement that he mattered. As the officer walked away, he couldn't stop thinking about John. He knew that $20 wouldn't solve all of John's problems, but he hoped it would give him a little hope. What the officer didn't know was that this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Over the next few days, the officer made it a point to check on John whenever he was on patrol. He brought him food, warm clothes, and even helped him find a local shelter where he could stay during the coldest nights. The two developed a bond, built on mutual respect and understanding. John began to open up more, sharing stories of his past and his dreams for the future. He talked about how he wanted to get back on his feet, find a job, and rebuild his life. The officer listened, offering encouragement and support. One day, as they sat together on the corner, the officer had an idea. He knew of a local non-profit organization that helped homeless individuals find jobs and housing. He suggested that John reach out to them, offering to accompany him to the office. John was hesitant at first, he had been let down so many times before, but the officer's sincerity gave him hope. "Let's give it a shot," John said, his voice filled with determination. The next day, the officer picked John up and took him to the nonprofit's office. They met with a caseworker who listened to John's story and outlined a plan to help him get back on his feet. It wasn't an overnight solution, but it was a start. John was given access to resources like job training, counseling, and temporary housing. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance. As the weeks went by, John worked hard to turn his life around. He attended job training sessions, saved every penny he could, and stayed focused on his goals. The officer continued to support him, checking in regularly and offering words of encouragement. Slowly but surely, John began to see progress. He found a part-time job at a local grocery store, which gave him a sense of purpose and stability. He moved into a small apartment, a far cry from the streets where he had spent so many nights. The officer watched with pride as John transformed his life. He knew that John's journey was far from over, but he also knew that the man he had met on that cold winter morning was no longer defined by his circumstances. John had found hope, and with it, the strength to keep going. This story is a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can have a profound impact. The officer's decision to stop and talk to John that day didn't just change one life, it changed two. It showed that compassion and empathy can bridge the gap between strangers, creating connections that have the power to transform lives. And sometimes, all it takes is one simple act to set that transformation in motion. As the days turned into weeks, John's life began to take a turn for the better. The part-time job at the grocery store, though modest, gave him a sense of purpose. He worked hard, showing up early and staying late whenever he could. His co-workers, initially wary of his past, began to warm up to him as they saw his dedication and kindness. John didn't talk much about his time on the streets, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was determined to prove to himself, and to the world, that he was more than his circumstances. The officer, who had become a constant presence in John's life, continued to check in on him. Their conversations were no longer just about survival, they began to touch on dreams and aspirations. One evening, as they sat in John's small but tidy apartment, the officer asked him a question that had been on his mind. "What's next for you, John? Where do you see yourself in a year or two?" John paused, staring at the floor for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking about that a lot," he said slowly. "I don't want to just get by anymore. I want to build something real, a life I can be proud of. Maybe even help others who are going through what I went through." The officer smiled, impressed by John's vision. "That's a great goal," he said. "And I think you're more than capable of achieving it." But the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. John still struggled with the scars of his past, both physical and emotional. The injury that had cost him his construction job still bothered him at times, making it difficult to stand for long hours at the grocery store. And then there were the nights when the memories of life on the streets haunted him, leaving him restless and anxious. He knew he couldn't do it alone, and he was grateful for the support system that had begun to form around him. The non-profit organization that had helped him find housing and work continued to play a crucial role in his journey. They connected him with a counselor who specialized in helping individuals rebuild their lives after homelessness. Through their sessions, John began to unpack the trauma he had carried for so long. It wasn't easy, there were moments when he wanted to give up, to retreat back into the shell he had built around himself. But the counselor's patience and the officer's unwavering support kept him going. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when John was offered the opportunity to participate in a job training program. The program, funded by a local charity, provided hands-on training in various trades, from carpentry to plumbing. It was a chance for John to learn new skills and potentially find a career that would allow him to support himself in the long term. When the officer told him about the program, John's eyes lit up with excitement. "This could be it," he said. "This could be my way out." The training program was intense, requiring long hours and a lot of hard work. But John threw himself into it with everything he had. He was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. His instructors noticed his dedication and began to mentor him, offering tips and advice that went beyond the curriculum. Slowly but surely, John began to regain the confidence he had lost so many years ago. He wasn't just learning a trade, he was rediscovering his worth. Meanwhile, the officer continued to be a source of encouragement. He attended John's graduation from the training program, clapping loudly as John received his certificate. After the ceremony, the two men sat down for a cup of coffee, reflecting on how far John had come. "I'm proud of you," the officer said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've worked so hard for this." John smiled, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You believed in me when no one else did. That meant everything." The officer shook his head. "You did this, John. I just gave you a little push. The rest was all you." As John's confidence grew, so did his desire to give back. He began volunteering at the shelter where he had once stayed, sharing his story with others who were struggling. His words carried weight because he had lived through the same hardships. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges of rebuilding a life, but he also offered hope. "If I can do it, so can you," he would say. His presence became a source of inspiration for many, a living reminder that change was possible. The officer, too, found himself changed by the experience. His interactions with John had opened his eyes to the struggles faced by so many in the community. He began to approach his work with a new perspective, focusing not just on enforcing the law but on helping those in need. He started collaborating with local organizations to create programs that addressed the root causes of homelessness, from job training to mental health support. His colleagues noticed the shift in him and began to follow his lead, creating a ripple effect of compassion within the department. One evening, as the officer and John walked through the park, they came across a young man sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. He looked lost, much like John had on that cold winter morning when their paths first crossed. The officer glanced at John, who nodded understandingly. Together, they approached the young man, offering a kind word and a listening ear. It was a small gesture, but it carried the same spirit of kindness that had changed John's life. As they walked away, John turned to the officer and said, "You know, it's funny. I used to think I was invisible, like no one cared if I lived or died. But now I see that we're all connected. One act of kindness can change everything." The officer nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're right," he said. "And it's not just about helping one person. It's about creating a community where everyone has a chance to succeed." The two men continued their walk, their bond stronger than ever. They had started as strangers, brought together by a simple act of kindness. Now, they were partners in a shared mission to make the world a little brighter, one person at a time. And as they looked ahead, they knew that their journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, lives to touch, and stories to write. But they were ready, fueled by the belief that even the smallest actions could create waves of change. As the months passed, John's life continued to improve. He completed the job training program with flying colors, earning certifications in carpentry and basic plumbing. The skills he gained opened doors to new opportunities, and he soon found himself working for a local construction company. It wasn't just a job, it was a fresh start. For the first time in years, John felt like he was building something meaningful, both literally and figuratively. The officer, who had become a close friend and mentor, often stopped by John's worksite to check on him. He would watch with pride as John measured, cut, and hammered with precision, his hands steady and his focus unwavering. "You've come a long way," the officer said one afternoon, handing John a bottle of water. John wiped the sweat from his brow and smiled. "Yeah, I guess I have. It's still hard to believe sometimes." But even as John's life improved, he never forgot where he came from. He continued to volunteer at the shelter, sharing his story and offering encouragement to those who were still struggling. His presence there was a beacon of hope, a living example that change was possible. One evening, after a long day at work, John arrived at the shelter to find a young woman sitting alone in the corner. She looked exhausted, her eyes hollow and her shoulders slumped. John recognized the look. It was the same one he had worn for so long. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay?" The woman looked up, startled, but there was no hostility in her eyes, just weariness. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." John sat down beside her, his voice gentle. "I've been there," he said. "I know how it feels. But you're stronger than you think. You just have to take it one day at a time." The woman listened as John shared his story, her eyes widening in disbelief. "You were really homeless?" she asked. John nodded. "For almost 2 years. But I got help, and now I'm working and living on my own. If I can do it, so can you." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in a long time, there was a flicker of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." John's ability to connect with others in similar situations didn't go unnoticed. The shelter's staff began to rely on him as a mentor, someone who could reach people in a way that others couldn't. They offered him a part-time position as a peer support specialist, a role that allowed him to use his experiences to help others. John accepted the job eagerly, seeing it as another step toward his goal of giving back. Meanwhile, the officer continued to advocate for change within the community. He worked closely with local leaders and organizations to develop programs aimed at addressing the root causes of homelessness. One of his initiatives was a partnership between the police department and the nonprofit that had helped John. The program, called Bridges to Hope, provided resources like job training, mental health services, and housing assistance to individuals in need. It was a holistic approach, one that recognized the complexity of the issue and sought to address it from multiple angles. The officer often invited John to speak at community meetings and events, sharing his story to raise awareness and inspire action. John was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't exactly his forte, but he quickly found his voice. His words were raw and honest, touching the hearts of everyone who listened. "I used to think I was invisible," he would say. "But then someone saw me. And that changed everything." The impact of John's story extended far beyond the local community. News outlets began to take notice, and soon, John and the officer were featured in newspapers and on television. Their story resonated with people across the country, sparking conversations about homelessness and the power of compassion. Letters and emails poured in from individuals who had been inspired by their journey, many of them sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. But with the attention came challenges. John found himself grappling with the weight of his newfound role as a public figure. He worried about letting people down, about not being able to live up to the expectations that others had of him. The officer, sensing his friend's unease, offered some sage advice. "You don't have to be perfect, John," he said. "You just have to be yourself. That's more than enough." John took those words to heart, reminding himself that his journey was his own. He continued to focus on the things that mattered most: his work, his volunteer efforts, and his relationships. He even started saving money, setting aside a little each month with the goal of one day owning his own home. It was a lofty dream, but one that felt within reach. One evening, as John and the officer sat on the steps of the shelter, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about that day?" John asked. "The day you stopped to talk to me?" The officer nodded. "All the time," he said. "It's funny how one small decision can change everything." John smiled. "Yeah. It changed my life. And it changed yours too, didn't it?" The officer chuckled. "It sure did. I thought I was just doing my job, but it turned out to be so much more than that." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, the two men sat in comfortable silence. They knew that their journey was far from over, that there would always be more work to do, more lives to touch. But in that moment, they allowed themselves to feel a sense of pride and gratitude. They had started as strangers, brought together by a simple act of kindness. Now, they were partners in a shared mission, united by the belief that even the smallest actions could create waves of change. And as they looked ahead, they knew that the best was yet to come. John's life was now a far cry from the cold, lonely days he had spent on the streets. His days were filled with purpose, working at the construction site during the day, volunteering at the shelter in the evenings, and spending his weekends mentoring others who were trying to rebuild their lives. He had become a pillar of hope in the community, a living testament to the power of resilience and kindness. But as his responsibilities grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day at work, John returned to his small apartment feeling drained. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the walls, and for the first time in months, he felt a familiar pang of doubt creeping in. Am I really making a difference, he wondered. Or am I just fooling myself? The thought lingered, gnawing at him as he tried to shake it off. He knew he had come a long way, but the fear of slipping back into his old life was always there, lurking in the shadows. The next day, John decided to open up about his struggles during his counseling session. His counselor, a kind and patient woman named Lisa, listened intently as he poured out his heart. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, John admitted. Everyone looks up to me now, but what if I can't live up to their expectations? What if I fail? Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's natural to feel that way, John, she said. You've taken on a lot, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But remember, you're not alone. You have people who care about you and want to support you. And it's okay to ask for help when you need it. Her words struck a chord with John. He realized that he had been so focused on helping others that he had neglected his own needs. He decided to take a step back and focus on self-care, something he had never really prioritized before. He started setting aside time each day to relax and recharge, whether it was reading a book, going for a walk, or simply sitting quietly with his thoughts. It was a small change, but it made a big difference. Meanwhile, the officer was facing challenges of his own. His work with the Bridges to Hope program had gained momentum, but it also brought with it a new set of responsibilities. He found himself juggling long hours at the police department with meetings, events, and outreach efforts. It was rewarding work, but it was also exhausting. Like John, he began to feel the weight of expectations pressing down on him. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, the officer decided to pay John a visit. He found him at the shelter, helping serve dinner to the residents. The two men stepped outside for some fresh air, and the officer opened up about his struggles. I feel like I'm spread too thin, he admitted. There's so much to do, and I don't want to let anyone down. John listened, nodding in understanding. I know exactly how you feel, he said. But you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself too. The officer smiled, appreciating the irony of receiving the same advice he had given John months earlier. You're right, he said. I guess I needed to hear that. The two men made a pact to support each other, not just in their work but in their personal lives as well. They started meeting regularly to check in and share their thoughts, creating a safe space where they could be honest about their struggles. It was a reminder that even the strongest people need someone to lean on. As the weeks went by, John and the officer continued to make strides in their respective roles. John's work at the shelter was having a tangible impact, with several individuals finding jobs and housing thanks to his guidance. His story had also inspired others in the community to get involved, creating a ripple effect of kindness and support. The officer, meanwhile, was making progress with the Bridges to Hope program, securing funding and partnerships that would allow it to expand its reach. But their journey wasn't without its setbacks. One evening, John received a call from the construction company where he worked. They informed him that they were downsizing and that his position was being eliminated. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. He had worked so hard to build a stable life, and now it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. John called the officer, his voice trembling as he shared the news. "I don't know what to do," he said. "I feel like I'm back at square one." The officer listened, his heart aching for his friend. "You're not back at square one," he said firmly. "You've come too far to let this setback define you. We'll figure this out together." True to his word, the officer sprang into action. He reached out to his network of contacts, looking for job opportunities that would be a good fit for John. He also connected him with a career counselor who could help him update his resume and prepare for interviews. John, though initially discouraged, decided to approach the situation with the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. After weeks of searching, John landed an interview with a local contractor who was impressed by his skills and work ethic. The interview went well, and a few days later, John received the news he had been hoping for: he got the job. It was a moment of triumph, a reminder that setbacks were just temporary obstacles on the path to success. The officers celebrated the news with John, treating him to dinner at a small diner they both loved. As they sat in their usual booth, the two men reflected on the journey they had shared. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" John said, a smile playing on his lips. The officer nodded. "Yeah, we have. But look how far we've come. And the best part is, we're just getting started." As they left the diner that night, John felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew that life would always have its ups and downs, but he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. And with the officer by his side, he felt ready to take on the world. Their story was far from over, but one thing was certain: they had proven that even in the face of adversity, kindness, resilience, and the power of human connection could light the way forward. And as they looked ahead, they knew that their journey was just beginning. With his new job secured, John felt a renewed sense of stability and purpose. The contractor he worked for was impressed by his dedication and skill, often assigning him to more complex projects. John took pride in his work, knowing that each nail he hammered and each beam he secured was a step toward building not just structures, but a future he could be proud of. His co-workers respected him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged. But John's journey wasn't just about rebuilding his own life, it was about helping others do the same. His role as a peer support specialist at the shelter had grown, and he was now mentoring several individuals who were navigating the difficult path out of homelessness. One of them was a young man named Alex, who reminded John a lot of himself. Alex had been on the streets for over a year, struggling with addiction and a lack of direction. When John first met him, Alex was skeptical, his guard firmly up. But over time, John's patience and empathy began to break through. "You don't have to do this alone," John told him one evening as they sat in the shelter's common area. "I've been where you are, and I know how hard it is. But if you're willing to put in the work, I'll be right here with you every step of the way." Alex looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly. John smiled. "Then we'll figure it out together. Nobody's perfect, Alex. It's about progress, not perfection." The officer, too, was making strides in his efforts to create systemic change. The Bridges to Hope program had gained significant traction, with more funding and resources being allocated to support its initiatives. The officer worked tirelessly, collaborating with local businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies to address the root causes of homelessness. He also continued to advocate for a more compassionate approach within the police department, encouraging his colleagues to see their role as not just enforcers of the law, but as community builders. One of the program's most impactful initiatives was a job fair specifically designed for individuals transitioning out of homelessness. The officer and his team worked closely with local employers to create opportunities for people like John and Alex. The event was a resounding success, with dozens of attendees finding employment and hope for a brighter future. John attended the fair, not as a job seeker, but as a mentor, offering encouragement and advice to those who were taking their first steps toward rebuilding their lives. As the months passed, John's relationship with Alex deepened. He became a constant source of support, helping Alex navigate the challenges of sobriety, job training, and finding stable housing. There were setbacks along the way, moments when Alex felt like giving up, but John was always there to remind him of how far he had come. "You're stronger than you think," John would say. "And you're not alone." One evening, after a particularly tough day, Alex turned to John with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've done so much for me, and I don't even know why." John placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady and kind. "Because someone did the same for me," he said. "And if I can help even one person the way I was helped, then it's all worth it." The officer, too, found himself inspired by the progress he was seeing. He often visited the shelter, not just to check on John, but to connect with the individuals there. He listened to their stories, offered words of encouragement, and worked to connect them with the resources they needed. His presence became a symbol of hope, a reminder that the police could be allies in the fight against homelessness. But despite the progress, there were still challenges to face. One of the biggest was the lack of affordable housing in the city. Many of the individuals who found jobs through the Bridges to Hope program still struggled to secure stable housing, as rents continued to rise. The officer knew that this was a systemic issue that required long-term solutions, and he began to advocate for policy changes at the local and state levels. John, too, became involved in the fight for affordable housing. He shared his story at city council meetings, urging officials to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable. His words carried weight, not just because of his personal experience, but because of the authenticity and passion with which he spoke. "Housing isn't just a roof over your head," he said during one meeting. "It's stability. It's safety. It's the foundation for everything else." As John and the officer continued their work, they began to see the impact of their efforts ripple through the community. More people were getting involved, from volunteers to business owners to policymakers. The conversation around homelessness was shifting, from one of blame and indifference to one of compassion and action. It was a slow process, but it was progress. One evening, as John and the officer sat on the steps of the shelter, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" John asked. "If you hadn't stopped to talk to me that day?" The officer smiled. "All the time," he said. "But I also think about how much we've both grown since then. This journey hasn't just changed your life, it's changed mine too." John nodded, a sense of gratitude washing over him. He knew that his journey was far from over, that there would always be more work to do and more lives to touch. But in that moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had started as a man with nothing, lost and alone. Now, he was a mentor, an advocate, and a beacon of hope. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, John and the officer sat in comfortable silence. They knew that their work was far from done, that there would always be challenges to face and obstacles to overcome. But they also knew that they were making a difference, one life at a time. And as they looked ahead, they felt a sense of hope and determination, knowing that even the smallest actions could create waves of change. The seasons changed, and with them, the lives of John, the officer, and the community they had touched continued to evolve. John's reputation as a mentor and advocate grew, and he began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and events beyond the city. His story resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring them to take action in their own communities. Though he was humbled by the attention, John never lost sight of his roots. He remained deeply committed to the shelter and the individuals he mentored, including Alex, who was now making steady progress in his own journey. Alex had secured a part-time job at a local warehouse and was attending weekly counseling sessions to address his addiction. He had also moved into a transitional housing program, a significant step toward stability. John was proud of him, but he also knew that the road ahead would be challenging. "You're doing great," John told him one evening as they sat in the shelter's courtyard. "Just remember, it's okay to ask for help when you need it. We're all in this together." The officer, too, was seeing the fruits of his labor. The Bridges to Hope program had expanded to include a mobile outreach unit, which provided resources and support to individuals in underserved areas. The unit was staffed by social workers, medical professionals, and volunteers, many of whom had been inspired by John's story. The officer often joined the outreach team, using his position to build trust and bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. One afternoon, while on outreach duty, the officer encountered a woman named Maria, who was living in a makeshift tent under a bridge. She had been on the streets for years, her spirit worn down by hardship and neglect. The officer approached her gently, introducing himself and offering her a warm meal. At first, Maria was wary, her eyes filled with suspicion. But as the officer spoke, his tone kind and his words sincere, she began to open up. "I've lost everything," Maria said, her voice trembling. "My family, my home, my hope. I don't know how to start over." The officer listened, his heart heavy with empathy. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "There are people who want to help you, including me. Let's take it one step at a time." The officer connected Maria with the outreach team, who helped her access medical care, counseling, and temporary housing. It was a small but significant step, one that reminded the officer why he had started this work in the first place. He shared Maria's story with John, who nodded in understanding. "That's what it's all about," John said. "Seeing people as people, not problems. It's amazing what can happen when we just take the time to care." As their work continued, John and the officer began to explore new ways to create lasting change. One of their most ambitious projects was a community garden initiative, aimed at providing fresh produce and job training for individuals transitioning out of homelessness. The idea came from John, who had always found solace in nature during his time on the streets. "It's not just about food," he explained. "It's about giving people a sense of purpose, something to nurture and care for." The officer loved the idea and helped secure funding and land for the project. Together, they rallied volunteers from the community, including many of the individuals John had mentored. The garden quickly became a symbol of hope and renewal, a place where people could come together to grow not just vegetables, but connections and opportunities. One sunny Saturday, John and the officer joined a group of volunteers to break ground on the garden. As they dug into the earth, their hands dirty and their faces glowing with sweat, they felt a sense of camaraderie and purpose. "This is what it's all about," John said, looking around at the smiling faces. "Building something together, something that will last." The garden project also caught the attention of local media, who featured it in a series of stories about innovative solutions to homelessness. John and the officer were invited to speak about their work on a popular morning talk show, an opportunity they used to advocate for systemic change. "Homelessness isn't just an individual problem," John said during the interview. "It's a community problem. And it's going to take all of us working together to solve it." The officer echoed his sentiments, emphasizing the importance of compassion and collaboration. "We can't arrest our way out of this issue," he said. "We need to address the root causes: lack of affordable housing, mental health services, and job opportunities. And we need to do it with empathy and respect." The interview sparked a wave of support, with viewers reaching out to offer donations, volunteer hours, and ideas for expanding the garden project. John and the officer were overwhelmed by the response, but they also knew that it was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. As the months went by, the garden flourished, becoming a vibrant hub of activity and growth. It provided fresh produce for the shelter and local food banks, as well as job training for individuals like Alex, who had taken on a leadership role in the project. "I never thought I'd be good at anything," Alex admitted one day as he showed John the rows of tomatoes he had planted. "But this feels right." John smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "You've always had it in you," he said. "Sometimes, we just need someone to help us see it." The officer, too, found fulfillment in the garden, often stopping by to lend a hand or simply enjoy the peace it offered. It was a reminder of why he had become a police officer in the first place, to serve and protect, not just through enforcement, but through connection and care. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John and the officer sat on a bench in the garden, surrounded by the fruits of their labor. "We've come a long way," John said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But there's still so much to do." The officer nodded, his gaze fixed on the rows of plants stretching out before them. "Yeah, but look at what we've built," he said. "This garden, this community, it's proof that change is possible. And as long as we keep working together, there's no limit to what we can achieve." As they sat in the quiet of the evening, the two men felt a deep sense of purpose and hope. They knew that their journey was far from over, that there would always be challenges to face and lives to touch. But they also knew that they were making a difference, one act of kindness, one seed planted, one life changed at a time. And as they looked ahead, they felt ready to face whatever came next, united by the belief that even the smallest actions could create waves of change. The community garden had become a symbol of hope, not just for John and the officer, but for the entire city. It was a place where people from all walks of life came together, volunteers, shelter residents, local businesses, and even schoolchildren. The garden thrived, producing not only fresh vegetables but also a sense of unity and purpose. For John, it was a dream realized, a tangible representation of the change he had fought so hard to create. One crisp autumn morning, John stood in the garden, surveying the rows of vibrant greens and ripening vegetables. Alex was nearby, teaching a group of newcomers how to plant seedlings. The sight filled John with pride. Alex had come so far, from a man struggling with addiction and despair to a confident leader helping others find their way. John walked over and clapped him on the back. "You're doing great," he said. "I'm proud of you." Alex smiled, his face glowing with a sense of accomplishment. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You believed in me when no one else did." John shook his head. "You did the hard work, Alex. I just gave you a little push." The officer arrived shortly after, carrying a box of supplies for the garden. He had become a regular presence there, often stopping by to lend a hand or simply check in. "Looks like everything's coming along nicely," he said, setting the box down. "You two have really built something special here." John nodded, a sense of gratitude washing over him. "It's not just us," he said. "It's everyone who's pitched in. This garden is proof of what we can do when we work together." As the three men worked side by side, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had started with a simple act of kindness, a police officer stopping to talk to a homeless man on a cold winter morning. That moment had sparked a chain reaction, leading to friendships, opportunities, and a community united by compassion. But their work was far from over. The officer had been advocating for policy changes at the city level, pushing for increased funding for affordable housing and mental health services. He had also been working to expand the Bridges to Hope program, creating partnerships with businesses and organizations to provide more resources for those in need. John, too, had been busy. In addition to his work at the garden and the shelter, he had started a mentorship program for young people at risk of homelessness. The program paired at-risk youth with mentors who could provide guidance, support, and a listening ear. John often shared his own story with the participants, reminding them that no matter how difficult life seemed, there was always hope. One evening, John and the officer were invited to speak at a city council meeting about their work. They stood side by side at the podium, their voices steady and their words filled with passion. John spoke about the importance of seeing people as individuals, not statistics. Every person has a story, he said. And every story matters. If we take the time to listen, to care, we can change lives. The officer followed, emphasizing the need for systemic change. We can't just treat the symptoms of homelessness, he said. We have to address the root causes: lack of affordable housing, access to mental health care, and job opportunities. And we have to do it together, as a community. Their words resonated with the council members, many of whom had been moved by their story. By the end of the meeting, the council had pledged to increase funding for affordable housing and expand support services for those in need. It was a significant victory, one that filled John and the officer with hope for the future. As the months passed, the impact of their work continued to grow. The garden became a model for other communities, inspiring similar projects across the region. The mentorship program flourished, with many of its participants going on to find jobs, housing, and a renewed sense of purpose. And the Bridges to Hope program expanded, reaching more individuals than ever before. But perhaps the most profound change was in the way the community viewed homelessness. What had once been seen as an insurmountable problem was now understood as a challenge that could be overcome with compassion, collaboration, and determination. People began to see those experiencing homelessness not as strangers, but as neighbors in need of support. One evening, as John and the officer sat in the garden, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about that day?" John asked. "The day you stopped to talk to me?" The officer smiled. "All the time," he said. "It's funny how one small act can change everything." John nodded, a sense of gratitude filling his heart. "You changed my life that day," he said. "And in doing so, you changed so many others. This garden, the mentorship program, the policy changes, none of it would have happened without you." The officer shook his head. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was you, John. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to give back, that's what made all of this possible. You're the heart of this community." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, the two men sat in comfortable silence. They knew that their journey was far from over, that there would always be more work to do and more lives to touch. But in that moment, they allowed themselves to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. They had started as strangers, brought together by a simple act of kindness. Now, they were partners in a shared mission, united by the belief that even the smallest actions could create waves of change. And as they looked ahead, they felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together, they could overcome any obstacle. Their story was a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the human spirit. And it was a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always hope, and that hope can grow, one small act at a time.